do today is an introduction to the book of Jonah, which is what we're going to be doing, and it won't be a long study, 4, 5, 6 weeks probably, but what a wonderful, interesting book it is. By way of introduction, I just want to read the first 2 verses of the first chapter. These little books are hard to find, aren't they? You don't read them all. You don't read them all the time. And probably as children, we all had to memorize the books of the Old Testament in order and the books of the New Testament in order. But let's be honest, we don't have, except for Jeff, we don't have anybody young here. It's amazing how that slips away through the years. All right, now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah, the son of Amittai. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come before me. One of the things that struck me there is, for their wickedness is come before me. Wow. God sees everything. Not just the good stuff. God sees the bad stuff. And nothing is forgotten. So, introduction. Let me, I just put this in about a 5 or 6 outline order. First of all, let's talk about Jonah for a little bit, the man. His name means dove. Dove. He does not directly claim authorship. There is no place in the Bible that directly claims Jonah's authorship, but the information in the book, the details of his life, only Jonah could have known. And so the book is autobiographic. He was a prophet to the northern 10 tribes that we know as Syria. And in John 7:32, when the scribes were attacking Jesus, in John 7:32, they made a false statement. They said, because Jesus was from Galilee. Jonah was from Galilee. And the scribes threw it in Jesus' face that he could not be a true man of God, because there's nothing in the Old Testament that says there would be a prophet out of Galilee. Well, when they said that, they were wrong. Probably ignorantly, plus maliciously wrong, because while Jonah was a prophet to the northern 10 tribes, Assyria, there is no explanation of his ministry there. He was a contemporary of Nahum and Amos. Now, Nahum and Amos, their ministry to the northern 10 tribes is in the books. The only thing about Jonah is this ministry of his to the Ninevites. So when the scribes made that charge against the Lord, they were actually wrong. There was an Old Testament prophet out of Galilee to the Assyrians. Now, prophet to the 10 northern tribes, there's 2 things about Jonah. He's the only Old Testament prophet ever sent to the Gentiles. Unique there. And he's the only prophet that's recorded in the Old Testament that ever refused. And there is a prophetic reason for his refusal, other than his own culpability, but we'll get into that a little later. So, Jonah. The date, about 760 BC. He was a prophet to the northern tribes under Jeroboam II, about 793 to about 753 BC. So we can fix the date of this pretty firmly. So the man, the date, let's look at the book. credited books by unbelievers in the Bible. What are some of the others? Revelation, Daniel, Genesis, and especially in Genesis, creation and the flood. The book of Jonah is right amongst them, amongst the top. Now, the problem is of the miracles. There are 10 miracles of God in these 4 little chapters. And unbelievers, of course, until the Lord opens their heart, have no taste for that and will deny it. It's the miracle element. Creation, flood, the plagues of Egypt, the plagues in Revelation. Here, the mocking point of unbelievers of the great fish. Critics, even supposed religious, I certainly won't call them saved. I think we would honestly be skeptical of a man or lady's salvation who does not receive the Bible as the Word of God. Would you all agree with that? And so I'm going to say religious people also have a large segment who have a problem with this book. They say it's a parable or an allegory. No, it is a factual, historical book. That is the only honest interpretation to the book. Jonah and the fish is an actual event. And the best thing we can say about the book, and I'm not going to read that now, I'm just going to give you a lot of information. You can check me out on this between now and next week. Matthew 12, verse 38 to 41, Luke 11, verse 29 and 30, Jesus authenticated Jonah as a historical person. Jesus himself verified that the book and its events are actual events. When Jesus gave credit to the book and to Jonah, he did not use it as an allegory or as a parable. He used it as an actual event. And by the way, what he really said was, you know what precipitated Jesus saying that? The religious crowd, not the saved crowd, they always received Jesus by faith. Even then, it's the religious crowd who said to Jesus, well, if you're the Son of God, do some miracles. Remember that? By the way, that crowd is alive and well today. Amen. Look at the masses that are drawn to where there's bright lights and great stuff going on. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to give you any miracles, except the sign of the prophet of Jonah and the fish. And as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days, 3 nights, so was the Son of Man. So there is no way that the book could have been an allegory or a parable, because it had to be an actual event, because the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ was an actual event. So there you go. All right, the times in which this happened, very significant for us today. Under Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom, remember there was David the king, Saul the king 40 years, David the king 40 years, Solomon the king 40 years. And Solomon in his old age became idolatrous and had many foreign wives. And so the Lord said, I'm going to rip the kingdom out from under you. I'm going to split it. I'm not going to do it in your day, Solomon, for the honor of your father. But I am going to rip the kingdom in half under your son. So Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, took the kingdom and surrounded himself with young men who didn't know any of the history. And long story short, the kingdom split, and it was 1.5 tribes versus 10.5 tribes. The southern tribe, Judah, nation of Judah, Jerusalem. The northern tribe, Jeroboam. And the 10.5 tribes, which became known as Assyria, which was idolatrous and anti-God. But even that kingdom had a time of great prosperity. Israel had, the southern kingdom had two enemies, Syria and Assyria. And they had gone through some real decline. And it was during this decline that, because of constant warfare, it was during this decline that Jerusalem was able to get strong again. And then after that, Assyria got so strong that the northern borders of Syria actually got back to the original borders under David and Solomon. And there was a brief period of time of about 75 to 100 years when Assyria became very prosperous under Jeroboam II. That was the time frame where Amos, Obadiah, and Jonah prophesied. So it was at a time when the kingdom of Assyria was greatly expanding. But during those 100 years or so of major prosperity, great expansion, it was during that time, and you'll recognize the pattern, it was during that time that they went into major spiritual decline. They went through major moral corruption. They literally became ethically bankrupt, and idolatry greatly increased. Does anybody recognize a pattern there of our own nation? If you want those verses, 2 Kings 14:24, Amos 4:1, and Amos 5, verse 10 to 13. Now, Jonah went there after he recommitted his life to the Lord and preached, and the city repented, and God relented. There's a difference between relented and changing his mind. God never changes his mind about anything, because God knows the end from the beginning. God knew what they were going to do all the time, and God knew what he was going to do all the time. So, but the fact is, 150 years after the Ninevite revival, God brought the Babylonian army and destroyed the nation and the city completely. The Assyrian captivity of the north came in 722 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. I've got two verses here. The nation that sinneth, it shall die. Sin is reproach to any people. That revival under Jonah lasted about 75 years. And then the next 75 years they went right back to the decline. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is I've lived long enough and I see a pattern. When I was a kid, of course in Germany it was pure persecution and death, and so church always does good in that time. Came to America, and I remember the first Wednesday night, I think we came, seems like it was on Monday or Tuesday, and the first Wednesday night, my parents wanted to know, was there a prayer meeting somewhere? And about 4 or 5 blocks from our house was a Romanian Baptist church. Now all the multi-speaking churches in Cleveland, all the churches, the Baptist churches in Cleveland were all, there was more than one language, because there was a great migration in the 40s, 50s, and 60s because of all the war in Europe. There was this great migration to America. And so we were told that there was an English-Romanian service. By the way, my folks also spoke Romanian. I think my dad knew like 6 or 7 languages. And so we made arrangements to go, and I don't remember all the details, but somebody picked us up and took us to that church. It was an auditorium, that old-style auditorium, much older than this. As a matter of fact, it looked a lot more than the old Washington Street Baptist Church picture that I have on the wall in my office. And the auditorium probably seated 100 people. It was an old-fashioned congregation. All the men on one side, all the men were on that side, all the women were on this side. And the place was packed. And the preacher preached, and when he announced the prayer time, every man on that side, every woman on that side, I mean, the place was packed, got on their knees. Right there with him. I've never forgotten that. That was my first introduction to a church in America. Now, I've been watching this for, let's see, I was 8, 76. I've been watching this for about 68 years or so, would that be right? And I think you all would agree, the decline spiritually, financially, we just, and still are, by the way, still are, but morally, ethically, our churches have, and when I say church, I'm talking about God's people coming together to sing, to pray, to fellowship, to study, to preach, and to pray. That's a church. We're not in the entertainment business. Now that crowd, their churches are going as fast as they can go. But what I consider biblically the model that I preached 2 Sundays ago, it's just down, 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 down. I want to meddle a little bit. I don't normally do this. I would never do this on Sunday, but to this crowd I sometimes take liberty. I am so personally disappointed in Brother Jeffries at First Baptist Church in Dallas. And I know what's going on. They've built a $330 million auditorium, and they got an organization where their electric bill is $25,000 a month. How would you like that? You wouldn't want that? You wouldn't want to pay that bill? So I understand the human side. I understand. Now he's under the gun to keep the place full, to keep the bills paid. I understand it. But he is going the way of Joel Osteen. Because he's going to, his New Year's sermon, most of you've seen his commercials, is about attitudes. Folks, that's psychiatry. That's psychiatry. Now, I'm not saying he's not going to do some good. Of course he is. But folks, the drift, well, I'll tell you what, the preachers of the 50s and 60s, even 70s, and before that, they would last 30 days in the modern. And I'm talking about Baptist churches. Never mind everybody else. I'm just talking about us folks. Well, they wouldn't last 30 days. They'd be out the back door. Folks, nothing new under the sun. Life takes these cycles. Life takes these cycles. Life takes these cycles. And so there's a little history about, by the way, Nineveh, the biggest city. I had a whole lot more. I'm missing a page. I want to give you some more about Nineveh. Founded by Nimrod, the great-grandson of Jonah in Genesis 10:11. Nineveh, founded by Nimrod in Genesis 10:11, great-grandson of Noah, city on the banks of the Tigris River, 500 miles northeast of Jerusalem. We'll get into this a little farther. You remember when God said, go there? Remember what Jonah did? He got a ship to go the other way. Where he was going, where he was going to go to Tarshish, was 500 miles to the northwest. You know, the question is, did he get away with that? Well, you already know the answer to that one. Nineveh was the Assyrians' royal city, the capital of Assyria. The Ninevites were worshipers of, now they did have several deities they worshiped, but the main one was the fish god. A god that was half fish and half man. That's where Walt Disney got his idea for that movie, by the way. It was the largest city in the world. Now remember, back then, they didn't have a fraction of the population that we have today. So a city of 660,000 was a monstrous, monstrous city. How big was it? Well, there was an inner city, and then there were the suburbs. Remember, it took Jonah 3 days to walk into it or through it or whatever. The inner city had a wall, just the inner city, what we would call downtown, okay? Like downtown Fort Worth, downtown Dallas, 8 miles. Just the inner city, 8 miles. And the outer suburbs were 60 miles, a district of 60 miles all the way around that. So, Nineveh was a big, big city, but Nineveh was a mean and cruel place to live. So, Nineveh. Let's see what else we got. All right. Let me give you an outline first. Now, let me make sure I have all my notes. I know I've got several pages of notes. Yeah, covered. We've done the man, the date, the book, the times. The theology of the book. Yep, I haven't said anything about the theology book. Very simple. Let me just run this by. God is sovereign. He rules all nations and men. God is a miracle-working God. The folly of disobedience. The sureness of judgment. God's mercy. God's intent to include Gentiles into the covenant. When we get into Jonah a little more, that was his problem. Jonah knew the Abrahamic covenant was a covenant to a Jewish state. Did not include Gentiles. And when God said Noah sent Jonah to go to a Gentile city, it just blew his mind, and so he wasn't going to do it. Let me give you this about the book. We'll get into this a little later. The book of Jonah and the man Jonah is a picture of Israel. It was to be a picture to the people of Israel. Jonah was Israel. Jonah represented Israel. He was sent outside of the bounds of Jerusalem to be a witness for Jehovah Jireh, the triune God, to a foreign nation. He refused. He ended up in the belly of the fish until God's time came to forgive him and restore him, and he went and preached. That's a picture of Israel. God chose Israel as his nation. They were to be his witnesses to the nations of the earth. They refused. They went and have and still are in judgment. They're in the quote-unquote belly of the fish. God will one day deliver them out of that, restore them, and they will, during the tribulation time, be a light to the Gentile nations. That was the primary lesson of the story of Noah to the Jewish people. By the way, God, through much of his own fault, but God sent, and his own problems, God sent one of his men to Nineveh, and they repented. And what God was doing, he's sticking a knife into the conscience of the Jewish state, because they had had many prophets, but they would not repent. If you want scripture for that, I know some of you are taking notes. Jeremiah 30:11, Jeremiah 31, 35 to 37. Okay, I need to get this done. So let me give you a verbal outline. Just listen. It's a very easy. Some books are so hard to outline. This one is a natural. Listen to this. Chapter 1, running from God. The commission of Jonah, the flight of Jonah, the pursuit of Jonah, the preservation of Jonah. Chapter 2, Jonah submitting to God's will. The helplessness of Jonah, the prayer of Jonah, the repentance of Jonah, the deliverance of Jonah. Chapter number 3, the fulfilling of God's will. The commission renewed, the prophet obeys, the city repents, the Lord relents. And chapter number 4, the questioning of God's will. The prophet is displeased and the prophet is rebuked. That's what we're going to be going through. Now, very quickly, let me give you also this. There are 10 miracles in Jonah. That's why you show me a book that's got a lot of miracles in it, and I'll show you a religious crowd that don't like it. So here you go, the 10 miracles. Number 1, the Lord hurled a great wind in the sea. Number 2, the lot fell on Jonah. Number 3, the sea ceased from raging. Number 4, the Lord appointed a great fish. We'll talk about this fish business a little later as we go along. Number 5, Jonah swallowed alive. Number 6, the Lord speaks, fish vomits not on land. 7, God saw they repented. He returned. They turned from the evil way. 8, by the way, if revival comes, God gives it. You understand? Revivals are miracles. Okay? Number 8, the Lord appoints a plant. Number 9, God appoints a worm. And number 10, God appoints a scorching wind. God is the control of nature. Every time I see a great, horrible weather event, fire, hurricanes, tornadoes, God is still the weatherman. God is not just a weatherman when the sun is shining and it's 70 degrees. We like that. No, God is the weatherman. If you'll give me about 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, don't make a theology out of this, okay? Don't do that. But let me share a story with you. Jewish historians from way back, even through today, think they know who Jonah was. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8 to 24, during the ministry of Elijah, there was a lady who told her husband, you know, this guy that keeps coming by here as he's traveling, I believe that's a man of God. Let's add a little room to our house. And that way when he comes by, he's got a place to stay. And so after a while, Elijah said, you know, you've been so kind to me. What can I do for you? She said, well, I'd like to have a baby. And Elijah said, well, my next year this time you will. And so she had a little baby boy. After a few years, that baby boy got real sick and died. And Elijah came and raised that baby from the dead. Jewish historians, I can give you scripture verse, Jewish historians for 2,500 years have studied this and analyzed this. And they're absolutely positive that that little boy was Jonah. Could it be? I don't know. Don't make a theology out of this. But let me tell you something. Why would I even lean that way? Why would I even tell you that? I've been studying my whole life in this book, and I see the kind of people that God uses. And I've been studying people my whole life in the confines of the local church. That would, to me, as to the Jewish historians, that scenario would fit to me. Because God always, God's people that He uses, He always brings them through, whether not physical, but at least a symbolism of some kind of death to self and alive to the Lord. The story of the boy would fit the scenario or the climate or the atmosphere out of which men come that God uses. So having said that, I just thought I'd share that with you. To me, that was very interesting. And but don't go out here and make a doctrine out of that, okay? Just because I said so. Well, let me just simple application. We have to close. And we're going to go through this book, and you will enjoy it. very practical and very good book. There are two verses, Romans 15:4. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And so we'll learn a lot here. And then the other one is 1 Corinthians 10:11. All these things are written as an example unto you, upon whom the ends of the world are come. God intended not only Jonah, but all of the Bible, all of the Old Testament, to be studied by us as long as there are Christians